The topic is the significance of African American history, and of course we have with us the uh, person from Vanderbilt University, Dr. Baldwin. Of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me welcome you back to the final segment of the show for today. Yeah. But Dr. Baldwin, as we indicated earlier, what we'd like for you to do is to sort of give us some statements in reference to what young people can do in order and how that fits into African American history today.
Yes, I'd like to preface my remarks by saying that part of the problem we're facing today is that we have not done a great job of passing our history on to our young people. Vincent Hardin has written a book called Hope and History, and in that book he talks about a kind of amnesia that has engulfed Black America. The fact that we've forgotten in many cases much of our history, and of course we failed in our institutions to pass that history on. Our churches, our families, the extended family, as you well know, is very important in our history and has been a force in passing that history from one generation to another via folk tales, music, etc., other art forms. But we failed to do that, I think, and this accounts in part for the high levels of crime and drug addiction and other problems that we are dealing with in our communities. Because if people don't know their history, if they don't study their history, they actually have no basis for self-esteem and self-growth and advancement and empowerment. Because empowerment is not only about economic growth, it's also about spiritual and intellectual growth. And I think that makes it clear to me that we need to become more serious about how we pass this history on from generation to generation.
Now, what can we do as a community to perhaps encourage more young people to become involved in this history, to know more about themselves?
Well, I think we have to work through our institutions, and I think the church is still very, very important. Temples, mosques, other religious institutions. I think the family, once again, has to become an educational tool as far as passing on the values and traditions of the Black community. So I think we have to work through our institutions. The schools are very, very important as well, because we can't depend on outsiders to teach us that history, to keep us informed about what's going on in the Black community. So I think we have to work through our institutions.
You know, quite recently, people talked about the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And of course, we will soon celebrate the 50th anniversary of that decision. Well, what do you think about that as a motivating factor in terms of perhaps encouraging more young people to become involved, to understand what it was like before perhaps Brown and after Brown?
Yes, I think that's very, very important for young people to know that history, because we're beginning to face some of the same problems we faced prior to 1954. Some scholars are writing about the resegregation of America. Being from Alabama, I've seen over the last few years schools that are still largely Black and largely white in Alabama, some exclusively Black and exclusively white. So scholars are writing about the resegregation of America, and if we don't know that history and study that history, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, and other events that occurred in the 50s and 60s, then we're prone to have to relive some of that that history, the unfortunate part of that history. So I think it's very, very important for students to understand that they have the type of education they have today because of people who stood up in the Brown v. Board of Education case and other events in that period.
You know, a lot of this has to do with what we might call Jim Crow and segregation and et cetera. How have we reacted in a real sense to this whole thing as a community to the separation of the races? I mean, what impact has that had upon us?
I think, unfortunately, it has had both a negative impact and a positive impact. I like to look at it in terms of the ambivalence of it, because in terms of the negative side, I would say that we've had to deal with the feelings of low self-esteem and because the system has told us in one way or another that we are less than and not equal to. And I think we've had to deal with problems of low self-esteem because being in a segregated system did not really heighten self-esteem in the black community. On the positive side, I think we were able to preserve certain cultural traditions and to preserve strong extended family networks. We were able to preserve our institutions, the church, for an example. And so I would think that you have to think in terms of the ambivalent side of that. The negative impact as well as the positive impact.
You know, and of course I recognize in you as a scholar of Dr. Martin Luther King. What would Dr. King say to, and of course you don't know what Dr. King would say, but I think that in terms of having studied King and having an idea in terms of how he felt about a number of things, what would be his reaction to some of the things that are going on now, our political participation and that kind of activity? How would he react?
I think he would be appalled at some of what's going on now. The fact that the gap between the rich and poor is expanding, that we are probably further from the goal of international peace than we were in his lifetime, with the situation in Iraq and the Middle East, Northern Ireland, and other hot spots in our world. I think he would be disappointed with the international situation. I think he would be disappointed with the economic situation in this country. The fact that joblessness, high rates of joblessness exist, underemployment, substandard housing, low educational standards in many cases. We have not built those standards up. I think he'd be disappointed with the high levels of violence and crime in our society. And I think he would see that as a cultural declension, that somehow or another we are moving away from the values that we should be embracing, the values of community and family and interpersonal, intergroup living, mutual acceptance, shared power. I think he would feel that all of this is missing.
Well, now, those individuals that you might describe as disciples of Dr. Martin Luther King, of course you would include yourself as one of those disciples.
Yes,
what are their reactions to what's going on now?
The disciples of Dr. King? I think many of those, and as you well know, many of his associates and aides are still alive, and many people who marched with him are still alive. And I think these people have pretty much the same view of society that he would have if he was here. And that is that we've sort of turned back the clock in so many ways. The violence and the crime and the drug addiction and the breakdown of the family and domestic violence and violence abroad, war. And these problems are still with us. As you well know, before he died, Dr. King saw three evils in America and the world that he felt had to be eliminated if civilization was to survive. And of course, they were racism, poverty and economic injustice, violence and human destruction. And unfortunately, we are still dealing with all of those problems.
Those are the three areas of violence?
Yes, Dr. King called them the evil triplets, or the evil triumvirate. Violence and human destruction, racism, economic injustice, and poverty.
And so finally, Dr. Baldwin, over the last minute and a half, and looking at all of these things that we've talked about dealing with the significance of African American history, do you believe that it is more as important now as ever that we continue to look at this particular aspect of the American experience?
Yes, I think it's very, very important. I don't think Black African American History Month has outlived its usefulness. I think we still need that as a tool for heightening self-esteem among our youth, and for keeping all of us abreast of what has happened to us over time, from generation to generation. The struggle has been a very difficult one, and it's still a very difficult one. We need to bear in mind what that history is all about, because those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
Very good. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, let me thank you very, very much for coming by and giving us the information about the significance of the African American experience and the significance of African American history. And I'm sure as we start African American History Month this year, that people will become more aware of why they are doing what they are doing because of some of the things that you've said. And I certainly appreciate that, and we want to thank you for that. And we also want to encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. And of course, if you have any additional comments that you'd like for us to deal with, then drop us a line here at the station. Thank you and good morning.